This lesson is on graphing functions from equations. When you're given an equation of a graph, it's going to have an example, y equals 3x minus 2. The easiest way to graph it is to just use a t-chart with some x values and some y values. Since x is the input, we're going to pick values for the input, put them into the equation, and determine the output values. You want to include some negatives, so -2. So when x is -2, that means we would have y equals 3 times -2 minus 2. So when x is -2, y is -8. Include 0 as well too, so when x is 0, y is -2. And include some positive numbers like 2, which would give us y equals 3 times 2 minus 2, which would give us 4. You want to include more numbers, as many as you can fit on the graph, to get the best picture for your graph. Draw the graph of y equals 4x minus 3. Determine if it's linear or nonlinear. Since I notice that the exponent of my variable is 1, I know this is going to be a linear function. To draw my graph, I'm going to use a t-chart, and I'm going to start with x is equal to -3. When I have -3 for my input, that would give me y is -15. I'm not being able to fit that on my graph, so I'm just going to keep working my way to smaller numbers. When x is -2, y is -11. When x is -1, y is -7. X is 0, y is -3. X is 1, y is 1. When x is 2, my y is 5. When x is 3, y is 9. And when x is 4, y is 13. I notice in my graph it only goes up to 10, so I'm only going to plot the points that I can fit. So I'm going to get rid of any point that's higher than 10. So the first point I'm going to plot is -1, -7, then 0, -3, 1, 1, 2, 5, and 3, 9. And it makes sense that my graph looks like a straight line because I already determined that my graph would be linear. And since my graph continues, I'm going to draw an arrow on each end, and I'm going to label my graph with the equation y equals 4x minus 3. Draw the graph of y equals 2x squared. Determine if it's linear or nonlinear. Since my x has a variable of 2, I know this is going to be a nonlinear function. So I know when I graph it, it should not look like a straight line. So x and y. Again, I'm going to start with -3. When x is -3, my y value is 18. When x is -2, my y value is 8. -1, 2, 0, 0, 1, 2, 2, 8, 3, and 18. Same idea as before, my graph only goes up to 10, so I'm only going to graph the points that fit. So I have -2, 8, -1, 2, 0, 0, 1, 2, 2, 8. And my graph continues to go up on both ends of the graph, but it does not continue to go down, so I'm not going to have an arrow at the bottom. And then I end it by labeling my graph, y equals 2x squared. Draw the graph of y equals the square root of 2x minus 2. Since I have the square root, I also know that this is going to be a nonlinear function. And I know that the square root of any number is going to have to be greater than or equal to 0. So I cannot take the square root of a negative number. So I'm going to make my t-chart. I'm going to start this time with 0 because I know that it has to be greater than 0. So when I plug in 0, I have the square root of negative 2. Cannot take the square root of a negative number, so I'm not going to graph that. When I have x is 1, that gives me the square root of 0, which is equal to 0. When I plug in 2, I have the square root of 2, which is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to leave that. 3 gives me the square root of 4, which is 2. 4 gives me the square root of 8, which is another non-perfect square. 5 gives me the square root of 8, another non-perfect square. 6 gives me the square root of 10, another non-perfect square. 7 gives me the square root of 12. 8, square root of 14. I'm just going to continue over here. 9 gives me the square root of 16, which is 4. The reason why I did so many here is because all these numbers that are non-perfect squares, since they're decimals, I don't really want to graph those, so I'm just going to plot the points that I know are whole numbers. So I have 1 and 0, then I have 3 and 2, and then 9 and 4. And since it's non-linear, I'm going to make my graph curve, put an arrow on the end, and there's not going to be an arrow at the other end because I can't have the square root of a negative number. And I'm going to label it y equals the square root of 2x minus 2.